Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last Keys webinar before the summer break. This time, we're going to talk about empathy. Empathy, which is definitely a topic which has become more and more relevant as many people have gone through such a tough time over the past year or so. So we will see how important it is to stay close to people in their everyday lives, in ever-changing environments, to really understand their hopes, their fears, and this will allow businesses and brands to adapt to connect with them more effectively. So as usual, we will kick off with Simon in London. He will take us through the first half of 2021 in the year so far. So Simon has kindly put together a mid-year report on how the public mood is evolving and what are the latest dynamics in consumer behavior. Afterwards, April in New York will talk about empathy awakened. She will talk about how decision makers can move to a more empathetic viewpoint to better understand the whys behind shifting behaviors, and also how they can develop solutions, products, services, and communications that are more tuned into what people really feel and need. After that, in Getting It Right, Douwe in Amsterdam will discuss how brand strategies can adapt to get this right. And at last, we will go to South Africa with Nanzana in Johannesburg, who will be our guide into the lives of sub-Saharan Africa people, and also to understand how brands can leverage how people feel and what people think in that specific area of the world. And with that, I will pass over to Simon to start our webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. Yes, what we thought we'd do 6 months into the year was to take some time out and have a think about what we're learning during these past few months and what may tentatively be about to happen next. I'm going to start by going back to the end of last year, when we asked people around the world to give us their predictions for 2021. And those predictions started with a look back on 2020. They were pretty clear that that had been a bad year for me and my family, for reasons we're all familiar with. And they were very clear that 2020 had been a bad year for their country. We were finding some optimism about the year ahead, but that optimism was always, let's say, fairly realistic in its nature, because again, at the end of last year, we found that 52% says it's unlikely that life will have got back to normal after the pandemic, and 61% were expecting people to be wearing masks a year from now. So those two predictions, I think it's fair to say, have been more true than not in many, many parts of the world, if not most. So what we're finding now, 6 months into the year, is we are living with coronavirus. It's still the #1 concern around the world, not as much as it was at the end of last year, when we asked people to think about their own country, and certainly a little bit lower than it was at the peak back in April 2020. And as coronavirus has continued to remain with us, we found that the list of countries where it's the #1 issue has been falling. So it was 16 at the end of last year, it's now 11. And as this has happened, it's served as a bit of a reminder, if it were needed, about just how those big issues, unemployment, poverty, corruption, crime and violence, when people are asked about the big topics in their country, those issues have not gone away. And we see that very starkly when we look at the results by country. We're asking people to pick from a list of 18, and we've got 5 countries where more than half are mentioning unemployment and jobs as a big topic in their country, a big issue for them. Poverty and social inequality, financial political corruption, also a number of countries really registering those very high indeed. So 6 months into the year, we're finding more people saying things are going in the wrong direction in their country than the right, and those numbers on the wrong track get quite high in a number of different countries. And the point about countries, I think, is also a bit of a that I need to be careful about slides like this when I'm showing you the global total. Globally, I might tell you that things haven't changed much in terms of how people feel about where things are heading in their country. But quite quickly, just by looking at the individual countries, we can see the dynamic that's going on below the surface. US, Britain, Italy, France, looking a bit better or significantly better than at the start of the year. Other countries starting from different places, by the way, but we're seeing often a negative movement, for example, in some parts of the world, in Japan, and indeed in India for a number of months of the year. So that's how people feel about their country or the overall outlook. What about their lives? And here our guide for these webinars has been our essential survey, which every fortnight goes to 16 countries to try to keep close to people's attitudes and their changing behaviors. And those of you who've been with us before on these webinars will be familiar with this chart where we ask people to self-assess where they feel they are on a pandemic recovery curve. And one of the findings, of course, has been that this has been a rather lumpy curve over the past 18 months. At the end of last year or into this year, we had many people in this reacting to restrictions or adapting to restrictions mode. And this was our title slide: New Year, same pandemic as new restrictions come on stream. Today, it's a slightly more nuanced picture. We do have more people towards the right-hand side of our charts starting to move towards, if you like, that better place. And in the US and China, we have as many as 39% saying that they're in the new normal or post-pandemic place. Rather fewer, however, in Japan, for example, just 7% there, and similarly in South Africa. And one of perhaps the most depressing numbers that I've been looking at just preparing for this webinar is this one, this 54% of people expecting things to take more than a year to return for normal, if ever. And it feels even more depressing when we look at it on the trend chart. If I draw your attention to the left-hand side of the chart, back in August last year, 51% saying it'll take more than a year to get back to normal. Well, today, that number hasn't really changed much. So we're really having to adapt our own thinking as the weeks continue. But it's not to say that our attitudes and behaviours aren't changing. And the example of travel, I think, is a good one here. Since the start of the year, the perceived risk of taking a vacation or holiday is rather less than it was. And that's been accompanied by a steady, if not dramatic, rise in the number of people who are starting to travel. That travel for the moment, largely domestic. If it is going abroad, it tends to be to a neighbouring country, but it's clearly an example of, yes, we're living with the crisis and the virus, but behaviours, of course, are changing and adapting, and we need to stay close to them. And in terms of staying close to people, it's very much a theme for our webinar today. I've just pulled out 4 studies that we've done during the first part of this year that might in some ways be emblematic of the broader society in which we live as individuals, or indeed at which the organisations we work for are operating. And the first one I wanted to mention is the International Women's Day study that we did in March. And the headline from that study showed absolute commitment among most people for closing gender inequality, but a sense that recovery from the crisis needs to take priority. Our study on Earth Day found an absolute commitment from people to do their part in terms of taking action on the environment. But they ask of businesses and of governments, what is the plan to tackle climate change? Our study on Pride pointed to really strong generation gap, and that's a topic we're going to come back to in later episodes of our webinar series this year, because it's something we all need to really think through from different angles. And finally, and perhaps most markedly of all, on World Refugee Day, people support the principle, yes, of people being able to seek refuge from war and persecution, but my own country has too many things on its plate for us to take many people at this particular time. So those are just some of the studies that perhaps help us think about that broader societal context. I leave you with the links if you'd like to go deeper. And I also leave you with a new publication that we released just a couple of weeks ago, looking at how advertisers can make better communications by really thinking about the context in which people are living their lives. Why is the guy on the cover wearing those purple Crocs? Aren't they a bit ugly? Well, perhaps if we put ourselves in his shoes, he's rather stressed, he's been working remotely, and if we put ourselves in his shoes, they're rather comfortable, and perhaps they make his day that little bit more manageable. So I'll leave you with that, and it very much also serves as an entree to our next speaker. And we're delighted to have April back on the Keys stage with us. She's been doing a lot of work over the last year to think about culture and about how cultural understanding can get us closer to understanding how people are really living their lives. Her podcast has just been nominated for an award, and we're delighted to have April with us to take forward this story about empathy and empathy unawakened. April, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Simon. So, yeah, I really would like to talk about empathy today because it has changed, right? Not empathy hasn't changed, but we have changed. And the need for empathy has really become that much more important as we move forward out of all those wonderful things that Simon just showed us in terms of the changes that we've been through. I kind of think about it in terms of us having a makeover, right? I like makeover shows because they show you the before and after, but in that after picture, you always sort of see a little hint of what people were before, but then it's totally different, right? So how do we figure out what people have held on to and now who they are, which can be very different. So, for example, we've got some new habits that we've all formed around health and wellness. Our homes take on a whole different thing, right? After having to work here and educate here, our workplaces are different. And this whole notion of digitalization, we've learned how to digitize, how to talk to people on Zoom, and digital assets need to be managed differently. We have a new appreciation for travel and where we're going and when we're going, and those little meaningful moments, even the short trips that you need to just get away for a minute. We've had a new appreciation for those things. And we've all got some new responsibilities. What's happened over the past year and a half has exposed a lot when it comes to inequalities, when it comes to the way we think about things. And so we've all picked a revolution of choice, and we've all had to decide on how we're going to participate in making the world a better place. So we've all gone through a makeover here, and the question is, what do we look like now, and how much of our old selves still exist in what we show today? So when you think of why empathy and why now it's so important, there's two different capabilities that I say we have to really harness. One is all the data, right? We now have so much data that we have access to, and we've got to stay at the forefront of that data to understand what is happening, what people are doing, and how that's playing out in their decision making. But we also have to have a whole nother level of empathy so that we can look beyond that data and look into the lives of people, and figure out what their motivations and emotions are, and what their emerging needs are, not just how they are behaving now, but what's about to come. So I think the two need to be balanced very carefully as we move into this next phase. So I'm going to use an example here when we talk about parenting. Here's what I hear from new moms. Seeing him grow inspires me every day, and it makes me a better person. I've never experienced love like I've experienced from this newborn. And when you look into the eyes of this little baby, how in the world could you think anything differently? But here's the real world of a new mom. This woman has on the sweater from several seasons ago, which hasn't been washed in a while. The baby hasn't been sleeping. The nursing hasn't been going well. Everything is making her weary. You can see it in her eyes. My favorite part of this particular picture is looking at the little girl in the background, because this mom has other people who want a piece of her, right? And how do we capture this? Because here's the mom that needs us, that needs businesses to develop products and say things to her that make her feel heard and that give her some sort of access to resources that she may not have at the moment. So empathy really is an instrument. It's not just a nice thing to do. It is an instrument for solving the problems of other people, and it's not just something that some people have and others don't. It is physically rooted in who we are. The issue is sometimes we have to remind ourselves about that, and we have to rebuild what we already know that is innate within us. So it actually takes things from your head and allows it to affect your heart, right? And once it's in your heart, it drives it down to a gut level. So now you have an intuition about these people and how they feel and what they're going through. And once you get that gut level response, it starts to move into your hands and your feet so that you can actually start to take action around what it is the people need, the people that you serve with your services and products. We talk about building empathy muscle, and the beauty of being at Ipsos sometimes is I get access to people like behavioral science people who just have the deepest way of looking at things sometimes. But our behavioral science experts have actually given me 5 key areas to evaluate when you look at an organization's empathy profile. So when you're in your organization, how good are they at building empathy muscle? So how are they motivated? Is there processes that are in place that can help people do things in an empathetic way? What about the social norms? Do people are the norms and values of the organization? Can you guys still see my screen?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, sorry. Are the norms and values of the organization ones that can really help you through? And then this idea of physical, how is the physical setup of the organization? Are there ways for people to continue to be empathetic? And how does that work within the organization? So those are all things that are really important as we try to do our jobs. And if we can start to get a feel for how that works, we can start to improve in ways that really build our empathy muscle. So how do you hear people? How do you listen to them? How do you see them? How do you see that little girl in the corner? And there's ethnographic principles that can help us do that. How do you understand them better? And how can you experience what someone else is going through? Those are all ways to get at really better understanding the why behind the data that I talked about earlier. So let's talk a little bit about that. I have a theory around dog conversations and cat conversations. This is my dog DJ here. DJ stands for Dog Jeffries. He is totally into me. If you see him staring at this picture, it is because he is completely interested in me. He wants to be with me. He wants to be in my presence. He knows when I'm upset about things. He knows when I'm arguing with someone. He knows when I'm happy. He feels joy when I feel joy. And those are the conversations that we need to have with our people, right? With the people that we serve. How can you really be a part of their lives? And how can you be genuinely interested in what it is that they're doing and how they're living? There are cat conversations, on the other hand. When I grew up, my apartment building didn't allow dogs, so we always had cats. But our cat Pippin, would run up and rub against my leg when he greeted me. I always felt like he wasn't really rubbing me; he was just rubbing himself. He was rubbing his own back. And so, how do we move from having cat conversations, which are, no offense, all about you? Cat conversations are Pippin trying to rub himself. Didn't really care about me or whose leg it was he was rubbing against. So let's think about having dog conversations. Dog conversations are people questions. How do you reassure people? How do you make things easy for them or build confidence for them? How do you inspire a moment? Whereas cat conversations are ones that we go in with. How do we build penetration or drive volume or increase frequency? How do I grow my market share? Those are about us. Those are cat conversations. So we have a program here that I think helps to pull all this together. It starts with building empathy muscle, as I talked about, and then you move over into having these good connect conversations that are dog conversations. You move into action so that now you can do something about it. Use your resources to help solve problems. And then move into this empathy ecosystem that I say. It's about taking all that you've learned and really trying to find a place to store that so that nothing gets lost. So if you can think about this as a framework in terms of all the different steps that are needed to really start to build a program of empathy in your organizations, I think it will help us to really understand people today and the changes that they've been going through. So I have shamelessly used pictures of babies and cute animals to get you thinking about what empathy might mean today. But please don't judge me, because I think it's important. It's an important conversation that we really need to have. So have dog conversations. Know this mom who is not necessarily all cleaned up and bright and bushy-tailed, but who's struggling so that you can help her, and have those kinds of things that that connect you to the people that you serve in the real world on a real basis. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thanks a lot, April. And you've really very nicely reminded of the power, us all, of the power of empathy and how we can train that muscle. So thanks for that. And I was wondering if across all the different companies that you're working with, global players, local players, if you've noticed in the past few months or so an increased genuine interest from businesses with this concept of empathy. Has this changed somewhat, or what's your observation on this topic?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions about empathy because people need to understand where people stand today. And I think most of my clients has realized that we've all been through some changes and that we're different than what we used to be. The other thing that's really taken a front seat is issues like social justice, right? Clients are trying to understand where they should play in this and how empathy can help them understand these people that are sometimes on the margins, not necessarily the ones that they have typically talked to. So yes, it has become a big deal.
Thanks very much, April. And I know you're very passionate about all that. So very, very nice to hear all you had to share with us. And continuing with our story around empathy, we're going to now move to Amsterdam with Douwe, and he will talk about brands who are getting it right and how they can be empathetic and connected. And Douwe, I know you've done a little miracle because you're going to summarize in just 8 minutes or so a long series of podcasts that have been very successful around brand strategy. So tell us about that.
Thank you, Jennifer. And it'll be hard to follow the shoes, the purple crocs of April, with her award-winning podcast and the super cute pictures of dogs, which I unfortunately don't have. But I'll do what I can. So yes, we did have a series of 8 podcasts discussing topics like how to set a more dynamic strategy, how important it is to go back to basics. Data-centric, consumer centricity, all kind of really more than 5 hours of interesting topics. We even touched upon side topics like competitive dog grooming and the Dalai Lama, for those who have listened to the podcast. But there's a lot of interesting content. And in order to summarize it in 8 minutes, I've used a metaphor of brands being in a harbor being anchored. And in the past, you could say that it's been quite peaceful for brands, right? All you need, or not all, but what you need is a clear and robust brand positioning, regular tracking, contextual changes were manageable, and one of your goals is to make sure that you get a stable brand portfolio management. So that's all well. But what's happening now that the context is changing dramatically? You're in the harbor, the storm comes up, so what do? And if you think about this context changing, I think we've heard from Simon the issues about unemployment, about crime and violence. April talked about social justice. We're still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we've got climate change. So there's a lot of contextual disruption sort of hitting our brands. But not only these big cultural changes, but also changes to our categories. Things like, in fintech with companies like Robinhood disrupting the investment category, but you also have Netflix, Alibaba, and Google. So a lot of stuff, this storm is hitting us on a boat. So what do? So when you're in a boat and you're on anchor, you need to make sure that your anchor is stronger than ever, right? You need to be, sure that you don't loosen your anchor and you start moving away, right? You need to make sure that your anchor doesn't snap, right? So you need to have a strong anchor. You need to make sure that your anchor line is a little longer, which allows you to go up and down with the waves and the swells so that you don't break loose from your anchor. And finally, with some longer anchor line, you also need to keep a good eye to the boats around you and boats that have maybe broken loose. So keeping an eye on your surrounding is more important than ever. So what is it? Let's go one by one over these sort of metaphors, right? One, using a strong anchor. A big discussion that we've had is that your DNA, your brand DNA is important, but it's more important than ever to really think what your brand DNA is and keep it simple, distinctive, and try to move it up to an emotional level, not a description of what your product is, but like what is your emotional, distinctive, simple DNA that all your brands can carry. A good example is Coca-Cola, that sort of embraces happiness in its DNA, right? It's simple, it's emotional, it's distinctive. So that's number one. The second metaphor that we've used is that strong anchor line, and that you could talk, that's your brand equity, right? It's really important to think about what is your brand equity, what kind of model do you use, but increasingly using, if you really want to keep your fingers on your brand equity and your brand strength, your tracking system needs to be more agile and simple and deliver super fast results more than ever. So rethinking your equity tracking system to make it simpler and making it more agile and faster than ever. And your third step is an interesting one, right? Making your anchor line longer, allowing for more agility, more local flexibility. Now, things like sustainability and brand purpose are super important. But in some of the discussions that we've had over the past weeks, some of our brand experts have said, well, it is really important that you position yourself strongly on these really important items, but it's very difficult to create a distinctive positioning on things like sustainability and brand purpose. That makes it kind of a table stake. And therefore, you need to find new other things to create a distinctive positioning. And thereby, you have to look at what is important locally. You cannot have anymore one big global positioning. You need to adapt it to needs on a local level, and use your distinctive assets to empower this local positioning. And finally, if you move your brand up from a product to more of an experience, it's going to be easier to come up with new products to compete with possible new competitors that is hitting you in these disruptive markets. An interesting example I found is how McDonald's is adapting to the needs of the local markets in Japan. I mean, it's clearly, in this example, you recognize the brand assets. It's clearly McDonald's. Yet if you look at the flavors, the teriyaki samurai burger, the Fuji apple McFreeze, the Abbey burger, it is clearly adapted to a local need. And then the fourth step is keeping a close eye on its surroundings, which is, when the storm hits, it's, as I said, it's increasingly important. One of the discussions that we've had with one of our brand strategists was the need for, instead of one big 3-year strategy and then keep your eye on that one strategy, be more flexible. See what kind of possible scenarios are going to hit your category. And then for each of those scenarios, create different strategies, which allows you to be more flexible depending what scenario is hitting your market, move left or move right and follow a different scenario with a different strategy. So be more fluid in your strategy. And then track the usage to find new trends, new occasions, new competitors that allows you to quickly adopt your strategy. And then, of course, follow social conversations and, if possible, even lead them. And a few examples that may bring this to life is, one of them is that Carlsberg introduced its new apple cider to cater to new outdoor drinking occasions, right? Or, which I find personally a super interesting example, is Harley Davidson. I actually bought a Harley last year because of its iconic patented twin engine sound. Yet this new Livewire, the new electric signage and green electric Harley Davidson bike, is moving away from that iconic sound to target this whole new trend of electric and green, etc. So the 4 steps that we've discussed: define your brand DNA in a more simple, powerful, emotional level. Track your brand equity in a faster, more agile way. Define agile brand positionings and think about scenario planning and fluid strategies. And then track your context. And then finally, with all the data that we now have available, it's now important to think about a framework for a more data-driven consumer centricity and create data-driven empathy. With all the data that we know, we are better at targeting individual customers than we've ever been before. And with the data, we can start looking for KPIs that have a direct impact on sales and usage. So that, in summary, summarizes 8 podcasts that we've had over the past sort of months. We'll start a new series soon where we'll talk more about how the brand strategy lives up in different regions, different categories, and different occasions. So I hope you're going to tune in to our new series as well. So Jennifer, that summarizes the presentation. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Douwe. You did an amazing job to summarize all that in such a short time, and we can't wait to follow your new podcast.
Thank
for sure. But I was wondering, as we prepare for the new one, you did mention a few of the experts that you've been interviewing, and so there's lots of interesting and different points of view that you've heard. And I was wondering if there's anything that stood out particularly for you over these various meetings that you had, or any like common thread that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, sure. Well, other than that, I never realized that there were hobbies like extreme ironing and competitive dog grooming. That was new to me. Google it, it really exists. But other than that, sort of in terms of brand strategy, I think there's a few things that were kind of surprising or interesting to me. One of them is this really push on data and data-driven, and even about empathy. Starting with data and combining that with sort of human curation and the link between the two. That's one. The second thing is that everybody talks about agility and the need to be faster and quicker and more agile and allowing for local adaptation. And the third thing I found interesting, that even though everybody's talking about innovating and doing things differently, there are still some things that has always been true, that back to basics, which is still true. Like in essence, consumers haven't changed. So there are some basic things that are still true. So be careful about throwing away everything you know and think the world is completely different. It's a balance between holding on to what is true and allowing yourself to be flexible and agile and doing things differently in this new world.
So we have changed, but there are some basic things that are still there, and maybe a touch of simplicity isn't bad also to remember.
Exactly.
Great, Douwe, thank you so much for sharing this lovely experience with us of talking with all these great brand experts. And now we'd like to bring this to life in a very specific region of the world. So we are going to fly from Amsterdam to South Africa in Johannesburg. And Nanzala is going to be our guide into the ways of living in sub-Saharan Africa, what people think, what people's aspirations are, and we're very curious to hear how brands can match those. So Nanzala, you're in Johannesburg, but I know you're not originally from Johannesburg, right?
Yes, no, I'm not from here originally. I'm originally from Kenya. And I dare say I'm now married to a Ugandan, so a little bit conflicted about where I call home.
So you're a child of the continent anyway.
I'm a child of the continent.
That's great. So yeah, so be our guide, please. Take us on this journey.
Thank you very much. So I'll just, following on to, and I'll just pick up from where Dara finished off and what April talked about earlier about empathy, and just bring this into the context of Africa and share some ideas on how to be a connected brand or to be a connected brand or to connect, as an organization as well. So Africa is one, yet it is one of the most diverse continents in the world. It is, the culture, the way of thinking, the value system of the people of Africa it's quite diverse, and it's influenced by various things. One is the original cultures. There are over 2,000 language groups on the continent. So these original cultures actually have an impact on build onto that diversity. The colonial powers, there is a very big difference between Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa. The Francophone Africa being a little bit more expressive in terms of fashion and food, and while the Anglophone being a lot more conservative. Religion, whether Christian, Muslim, or leaning on traditional beliefs. And in fact, on Christianity, it's whether Catholic or Anglican or Protestant, that has had an influence. The liberation struggles, the post-colonial ideologies. Did the country go capitalist? Did it go socialist? Was there post-independence war? What was the political situation in the country post-war? And globalization. And on globalization, we see that there's a move towards modernity, but this is in tandem with re-embracing the original cultures. We've seen that as generations are moving, the generations that are there, that further away from the colonial days, actually are, re-embracing the original cultural ways. But having said that, there are some golden threads that run through the sub-Saharan Africa. And I leave North Africa specifically because it's a lot more culturally, it's culturally closer to the Middle East than to the rest of the continent. So from now on, I'm just talking about sub-Saharan Africa. So now I'd like to I can't really describe, I can't bring it to life to you, then just like to share a video that captures the essence of the people of the continent. They talk about how they make a living, how they survive, how they make money. But in there, you'll see that they are independent, they are resilient, focused, and always planning for a better tomorrow. So let's just watch the video.
You mentioned there's a word here, like people doing different jobs, different forms of income.
In our local way of saying it here, when you say someone is hustling, il est en train de grouiller. That means he's working hard.
It's much harder when you're starting out, yeah. But if you know people, the more you stay, the more you know people, the more you get connections.
It's all about the technical who knows you there. It's not even about the technical how, like what can you do, what can you offer. It's about who do you know there.
Bon, une entreprise ne se crée pas sans stress. Le porteur du projet est constamment stressé.
Okay, pressure is there, yeah, but it depends how you handle it.
You need to wake up very early. Il y a beaucoup de pression, c'est naturel.
Because life is so expensive, so you have to do a lot of things. ማታ በር ላይ ቺፕስ መሸጥ ነው የምሰራው።
I'm a model. I also had an M-Pesa shop.
I sell shoes door to door, and I'm an actress.
Became a doctor. I'm a part-time driver. I have friends who have businesses, so I'm always acting as the middleman. I'm doing a bit of everything.
I'm running a part-time course on entrepreneurship. I'm a caterer.
People just know me as a music producer. People know me as a video director. I'm also a graphic designer, an interior designer. I'm a farmer too. I have a lot of chickens, or like 300 of them.
I do supply mobile phones, human hair, just to add to what I get monthly.
It's a hustle type of life. You have to manage. If you're good at it, you can manage at least more than 2 jobs.
Looking at the economy in Zambia, you can't just rely on one job.
So you see everybody hustling to become, I want to be a big person, I want to be huge, I want to do this, I want to do that.
You just have to be smart.
Hand to mouth, hand to mouth, hand to mouth.
Up here, be smart, make money, and be on top of your game. If you are not, the next person is going to push you away and move on.
There's a saying, if you want to make the future big, create it.
Zala, great video that you shared with us.
Thank you. So I'd like to share a few ideas with you on how brands have connected and can connect. And in my opinion, there are 3 buckets. Now, the first is brands providing goods or services that have social impact. The second is brands that enable. I mean, you had in the video, so the ambitions, the aspirations enable me. And then the third is aspirational brands. Now, an example of an organization that has, that has social impact is One Acre Fund. And just in case you're wondering what the size of an acre is, it's about 4,000 square meters or just under a quarter hectare. So this NGO recognizes that a large percentage of the African population actually survive on subsistence farming. So the organization then supports these small-scale farmers into their small pieces of land being a lot more productive, so that the produce can actually feed their families, but they can also have enough money for like healthcare and education. And it's not purely financed by donors. It has actually got a commercial aspect for sustainability. Now, moving on to brands that are enablers, I think the best example is the telcos. And this is why they're amongst the most admired brands in the region. And some of the services that the telcos are provided is just the connectivity, but the other is actually the mobile money services. This has enabled, the unbanked to be able to transact. 70% of the people on the continent actually run their own small businesses. They're not employed, so it has made it easier for these small businesses to transact. And as well, the social media platforms that have been enabled by the telcos have provided marketing opportunities for organizations, small businesses that were not able to market before. They can use those social media platforms. And I mean, it's even enjoyed by the well-to-do who enjoy the convenience of transacting on the mobile phones, paying for utilities, or even flights or holidays, at least when we used to travel. And finally, moving to aspirational brands, these are the most admired brand in the region is Nike. And these are a lot more to do with what the company stands for more than the actual products. And so just to conclude, I'll leave you with a few ideas. So you can have a global, it's important to have a global brand positioning, as Dawe talked about it, but we need to help to consider the local nuances when activating the strategy at a country level. So in fact, being able to pick up what we've talked about in terms of the differences between the various countries. And in fact, for some brands, I would imagine that a regional strategy, I would dare say a regional strategy it would have the desired impact, the differences between the coastal regions versus the inland, or the ones that are more Muslim than Christian. Those nuances actually would be important when you're activating. Now, the second thing is that local brands are preferred. So you'll see that people want to buy local. Local is lekker. But a global brand that considers that local context can also be just as successful. So if you consider the local context in positioning and in the communication and in how you speak to the population, that would make the brand that just as successful. And there are many global brands that have done that to the level that they're actually viewed as local. And then the people of the continent are moving a lot more towards traditional values, and it's just important to acknowledge that. The fourth thing is country is superior to continent. So I'm a Kenyan, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a South African comes before I am an African. Most of all, speak to the aspirations of the people of the continent. Have dog conversations, as April talked about. Thank you.
Great, Nazara. And I was wondering, what about you personally? Because you've told us all about these brands, but what about you? Is there any brand that you feel particularly close to you there in Johannesburg?
I have two. Can I talk about both?
Yes, if you're fast, yes.
So, very quickly, my first one is Nivea, but this is like really personal. When I moved to South Africa, the air it's like very dry, and I needed something that would keep me moisturized all the time. So this is my hand lotion. I have it with me everywhere. It said a woman's age shows in the hands. So this is like my best friend. But the second one is actually Vlisco, which is a fabric manufacturer. It's from Europe. It's in the Netherlands, even known as Dutch wax. But when you want to dress as African, then, like what I'm wearing today, when I want to be African, this is the fabric that you buy. This is the fabric that you go for to actually dress. So it's actually for Africa, even though it's from Europe. So those are my two favorite ones.
Great. So a typical global brand playing very local. That's a very nice example.
Absolutely.
Which closes very nicely our webinar on empathy. And I'd like to thank all our speakers and all of you who have been with us. And we'd love to see you again in September after our summer break. Have fun. Hope you will all be well and safe, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.